They left her to die in the desert heat, bleeding and alone, because she carried shame instead of a ring. But an Apache warrior heard her screams and tore through wood and prejudice to bring her back from death's door. Redemption Flats, New Mexico territory. Summer 1881. The sun hung merciless in a white sky, baking the red earth until it cracked like old leather. Heat shimmered in waves across the valley, distorting the distant mesas into ghostly shapes that danced and dissolved. In the heart of town, wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking shade from one another, their paint peeling, their windows filmed with dust. Beatrice Morgan stood in the center of the general store, her swollen belly pressing against the fabric of her faded cotton dress. Sweat traced lines down her temples. Her dark hair, once pinned neatly, had come loose in damp strands that clung to her neck. She gripped the counter's edge with both hands, knuckles white, breathing through a contraction that wrapped around her middle like an iron band. The storekeeper, a thin man named Hodge with wire spectacles and a mouth that turned down at the corners, stared at her with open disgust. Behind him, 3 women in their Sunday dresses whispered behind gloved hands. Their eyes were hard, their faces pinched with judgment sharper than any blade. "You cannot stay here," Hodge said, his voice cold and final. "This is a decent establishment. Decent people shop here." Beatrice's breath hitched as the contraction peaked, then slowly ebbed. She straightened as much as her body would allow, meeting his gaze. "I need supplies. The baby is coming. I need clean cloth, water, anything. You should have thought of that before you spread your legs for a man without a wedding band," one of the women hissed from behind the counter. Her name was Mrs. Pritchard, the banker's wife, a woman whose charity extended only as far as her reputation required. Beatrice felt heat flood her face, but it was not shame. It was fury, white and clean. "My husband died 3 months ago. Thrown from his horse on the way to register our marriage in Santa Fe. I have the license. It was never signed by the priest." "Convenient," Mrs. Pritchard sneered. "A dead man cannot confirm your lies." Another contraction seized Beatrice, harder this time, stealing her breath mid-sentence. She doubled over, gasping, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. When it passed, she looked up to find all of them watching her with the same expression. Not pity, not concern. Contempt. Hodge pointed to the door. "There is a shack 2 miles east, past the dried creek bed. Used to be a trapper's shelter. You go there. You do not come back to town until you figure out what you are going to do with that child. I cannot walk 2 miles in this condition." "Then crawl," Mrs. Pritchard said. The other women nodded in agreement. One of them, younger, looked away briefly, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. But she said nothing. Silence was agreement here. Beatrice straightened her spine, pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders despite the suffocating heat, and turned toward the door. She would not beg. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her legs trembled as she stepped into the blinding sunlight, the packed dirt street radiating heat like the surface of a stove. She walked. One step, then another. Past the saloon where men loitered in the shade, their eyes following her with lazy cruelty. Past the livery where the blacksmith paused his hammering to watch her struggle forward. Past the church with its whitewashed walls and closed doors, the reverend nowhere to be seen. Not a single soul offered help. Not a single voice called out in kindness. The town had made its judgment, and Beatrice Morgan was found wanting. The edge of town gave way to scrubland. Sage and creosote stretched endlessly in every direction, the air thick with their bitter scent. The sun bore down without mercy, turning her dress into a second skin of sweat and dust. Each step sent jolts of pain through her hips and lower back. The contractions came more frequently now, each one forcing her to stop, to brace herself against the agony that radiated from her core. She had walked perhaps a mile when she had to stop completely. A contraction so intense, it drove her to her knees in the middle of the dusty path. She knelt there, hands pressed into the hot earth, gasping for breath as the pain rolled through her in waves. When it finally released its grip, she looked up at the vast emptiness surrounding her. Nothing but rock and sand and the skeletal remains of dead trees reaching toward a sky that offered no mercy. She forced herself upright and continued. Her canteen, half full when she left town, was empty before she reached the dried creek bed. Her lips cracked and bled. Her vision swam with bright spots that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The baby kicked inside her, hard and insistent, as if protesting this journey into nowhere. Still, she walked, because stopping meant dying, and she refused to give this town the satisfaction of her death. The dried creek bed was a jagged scar cutting through the landscape, its banks steep and treacherous. Beatrice half climbed, half slid down the slope, her dress catching on thorns and rocks. At the bottom, she rested against a boulder, the stone still warm from the day's heat. She closed her eyes and thought of James, his laugh, his gentle hands, the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, even though no priest had blessed it. He had promised they would make it official in Santa Fe, promised her a life of dignity and love. They had been saving money, planning the trip, dreaming of a proper ceremony in a real church with witnesses and a registry. Then his horse had spooked at a rattlesnake on a narrow trail, and James had been thrown against a rock, his neck broken instantly. She had buried him herself on a hillside overlooking the valley, marking his grave with stones she carried one by one. She had wept until she had no tears left, and then she had tried to continue living, but the town saw only an unmarried woman with a swelling belly. They saw sin. They saw shame. They saw an opportunity to demonstrate their righteousness by casting her out. Another contraction forced her back to the present. She climbed out of the creek bed on the far side, her hands scraped and bleeding. The shack appeared in the distance like a mirage, a sagging structure of weathered wood and rusted nails. Its roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the door hung crooked on broken hinges. Beatrice stumbled toward it, her vision swimming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally reached it, she collapsed against the outer wall, sliding down until she sat in the thin strip of shade it provided. The wood was rough against her back, full of splinters. She did not care. She sat there for several minutes, trying to gather strength for the final effort of going inside. A lizard skittered across the ground near her feet, pausing to regard her with ancient, unblinking eyes before disappearing into a crack in the foundation. Above, a vulture circled lazily, riding the thermal currents. She pushed herself upright and entered the shack. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of rot and animal droppings. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, illuminating swirling motes of dust. A broken cot sat in one corner, its frame bent, its canvas shredded by time and rodents. Beatrice sank onto the dirt floor, her back against the wall, and let out a sob she had been holding since leaving town. The sound echoed in the empty space, swallowed by indifference. She tore strips from her petticoat with trembling hands, trying to prepare for what was coming. She had no water to clean herself or the baby, no blankets to provide warmth when night fell, no food, nothing but the determination to survive and the rapidly fading hope that somehow, against all odds, she and her child would make it through this. The contractions intensified as the sun began its descent. She lost all sense of time, all awareness beyond the relentless waves of pain. Her body moved on instinct, bearing down when it demanded, breathing when it allowed. Blood soaked through her dress, pooling beneath her. She could feel the baby moving lower, feel the pressure building to an unbearable intensity. Sunset painted the desert in shades of orange and purple. Through the gaps in the walls, Beatrice watched the light fade, watched the shadows lengthen and merge. She was so thirsty her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. But the pain would not let her rest. It demanded her full attention, her complete surrender. Night fell. The desert cooled, but not enough. Beatrice shivered and burned at the same time, her skin clammy, her thoughts fragmenting. She called out, but her voice was a whisper swallowed by the vast emptiness. She thought she heard coyotes in the distance, their yips and howls carrying on the night wind. She thought she saw shapes moving in the darkness beyond the broken door. Death, perhaps, come to claim her. Then she heard it. Footsteps, real footsteps. Not the shuffle of boots, but the soft, deliberate tread of moccasins on packed earth. She tried to lift her head, but the effort was too much. A shadow filled the doorway, backlit by moonlight. For a moment, she thought it was death come to claim her, and she almost welcomed it. The door, already hanging loose, was kicked aside with a single blow. Wood splintered and crashed to the ground, the sound sharp and violent in the stillness. A figure stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Beatrice's vision blurred, but she saw enough. Buckskin clothing. Long black hair tied back with a strip of leather. Dark eyes that swept the room and locked onto her with sharp intensity. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Help me." The man crossed the space in 3 strides and knelt beside her. His hands, rough and calloused, touched her forehead with surprising gentleness. "You are burning," he said, his voice low and accented with the cadence of someone who spoke Apache as his first tongue. "How long have you been here?" "Since morning," Beatrice managed, her voice cracking. "The baby." "It is coming." He looked down at the blood, at her swollen belly, at the makeshift cloths she had prepared. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Anger, perhaps. Or recognition of a cruelty he had seen before. "This place will kill you both. I am taking you. No, they will not let me back." "The town. I do not care what the town wants," he said flatly, his tone brooking no argument. He stood and moved to the corner, gathering the torn canvas from the cot. He folded it into a makeshift pallet, then returned to her side. "I am Dalton. I am going to lift you now." "It will hurt," Beatrice nodded, too exhausted to protest. His arms slid beneath her, one under her knees, the other supporting her back. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her, and she cried out, her fingers clutching at his shirt. She could feel the strength in him, the certainty. He smelled of leather and wood smoke and the desert itself. "Breathe," Dalton said, his voice steady, commanding. "We are not far from water." "Hold on." He carried her out into the night. The desert stretched silver under the moon, the air cool and sharp with the scent of sage. Stars blazed overhead in uncountable thousands, so bright they cast faint shadows. Beatrice's head lolled against his shoulder, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle. She felt the rhythm of his steps, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the first time in months someone had touched her without contempt, without judgment. It was the first time someone had chosen to save her. They walked for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Dalton's breathing never changed, never grew labored despite her weight and the uneven terrain. He moved with the sureness of someone who knew every rock, every bush, every hidden danger in this landscape. Finally, they reached a narrow canyon where a spring fed a shallow pool surrounded by cottonwoods. The sound of trickling water was the sweetest thing Beatrice had ever heard. Dalton set her down gently on a bed of soft grass near the water's edge. The grass was cool and damp, such a sharp contrast to the hot dirt of the shack that Beatrice almost wept at the sensation. He moved swiftly to build a fire, gathering dried wood and kindling with practiced efficiency. He struck flint until sparks caught it and flames began to lick upward. Within minutes, the fire blazed strong and steady, casting warm light across the canyon walls. He knelt beside her again, dipping a cloth into the cool water and pressing it to her forehead. The cloth was soft, well worn, clearly something he had carried with him. "The baby is coming soon," he said matter-of-factly. "I have delivered foals, calves, even a breech colt once." "It is not so different," Beatrice laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and relief. "Not so different. You will live," Dalton said simply, as if stating an immutable fact. "Both of you. I do not let things die if I can prevent it." Another contraction seized her, and this time she felt the shift, the overwhelming pressure, the undeniable urge to push. Dalton moved to her side, his hands sure and steady. "When the pain comes again, you push. Do not hold back." "I will catch the child." Beatrice bore down with everything she had left. The world narrowed to fire and pressure and the sound of Dalton's voice, low and constant, telling her she was strong, telling her to keep going, telling her the child was crowning. Time folded in on itself. One push became 10, became 20. She screamed, not caring who heard, pouring every ounce of rage and grief and determination into bringing this life into the world. And then, finally, a release. The pressure gave way all at once, and the baby's cry split the night, sharp and furious and alive. Dalton held the infant with hands that had probably held weapons and tools and 1,000 other things, but now cradled new life with infinite care. A tiny girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the desert sky. He used the cloth to clean her quickly, efficiently, then wrapped her in his own shirt, sacrificing his warmth for hers, and placed her on Beatrice's chest. Beatrice stared down at her daughter, tears streaming down her face, cutting clean paths through the dirt and sweat. The baby's eyes, dark and unfocused, blinked up at her. 10 perfect fingers. 10 perfect toes. A mouth that opened in protest at the cold night air. "You are here," Beatrice whispered, her voice breaking. "You are really here. My daughter. My beautiful daughter." Dalton sat back on his heels, his hands and arms streaked with blood, his bare chest gleaming with sweat in the firelight. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. "She is strong," he said quietly. "Like her mother. She will survive this world." Beatrice looked up at him. This stranger who had broken down a door, who had carried her through the desert, who had brought her daughter into the world with hands that knew only gentleness despite their roughness. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me when no one else would?" Dalton was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, turning them to molten gold. When he spoke, his voice was low, heavy with something unspoken, with memories that clearly still had the power to wound. Because no one should die alone in the dirt like an animal. And because the people of that town are cowards who hide their cruelty behind the word decent. "I know what it is to be cast out. I know what it is to be judged for things beyond your control." He stood and moved to the spring, washing the blood from his hands and arms with methodical care. Beatrice watched him, holding her daughter close, feeling the warmth of the fire, the softness of the grass beneath her, the steady presence of the man who had saved them both. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know why he had been near enough to hear her cries, why he had not hesitated to help when everyone else had turned away. What pain lived behind those words he had just spoken? But exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. Dalton returned with a leather pouch. He opened it and pulled out strips of dried meat and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "You need to eat," he said, offering her the food. "Your body has been through war. You must rebuild your strength." Beatrice took the meat with trembling hands and bit into it. The taste was unfamiliar, gamey and rich, seasoned with something she could not identify. But it was sustenance, and she devoured it, suddenly ravenous. Dalton watched her eat, then gently took the baby from her arms. "Sleep," he said. "I will watch over her. I will watch over you both. I cannot. What if something happens? What if she needs me? You must. If you die from exhaustion, she has no one. Sleep. I will keep you both safe. I give you my word. There was something in the way he said it, in the way he gave those words, that made Beatrice believe him. She wanted to argue, but her eyes were already closing. The last thing she saw was Dalton cradling her daughter against his bare chest. Saw the firelight dancing across his face. Saw the way he looked down at the tiny life in his arms, with something that looked like wonder mixed with old sorrow. And then she saw nothing at all when Beatrice woke. Dawn was breaking over the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The fire had been kept burning through the night, reduced now to glowing embers that pulsed with residual heat. She blinked against the soft light, disoriented for a moment, her body stiff and aching in unfamiliar ways. Then memory flooded back. The town, the shack, the birth. Her hand flew to her chest, panic seizing her until she heard the soft cooing sound to her left. Dalton sat against a boulder, her daughter still nestled in his arms, both of them sleeping. The baby was wrapped securely in what looked like a soft deerskin blanket that had not been there the night before. Dalton's head was tilted back against the stone, his long hair loose now, falling across his shoulders. In the gentle morning light, Beatrice could see him more clearly. His face was angular, high cheekbones and a strong jaw, his skin the deep bronze of someone who lived under the sun. There were faint scars on his chest and arms, the kind that told stories of survival. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. The grass beneath her was damp with dew, and the air smelled clean, like water and earth and growing things. The spring burbled softly, its surface reflecting the brightening sky. For the first time in what felt like years, Beatrice took a full breath without the weight of judgment pressing down on her chest. Dalton's eyes opened as if he had sensed her movement. He looked at her without speaking for a long moment, assessing. Then he glanced down at the baby in his arms. She woke twice in the night, hungry. I gave her water on my finger. It seemed to help. Beatrice felt her breasts, heavy and tender. I should feed her now. Dalton stood in one fluid motion and crossed to her, kneeling to place the baby gently in her arms. His fingers brushed hers in the transfer, calloused and warm. Beatrice brought her daughter to her breast, fumbling with her dress until the baby latched on with surprising strength. The sensation was strange, almost painful at first, then oddly comforting. This tiny life, depending entirely on her. Dalton moved away to give her privacy, tending to the fire. He added wood and coaxed the flames higher, then retrieved a battered tin pot from his belongings and filled it with water from the spring. He set it near the flames to heat. His movements were economical, practiced. The actions of someone accustomed to caring for himself in harsh conditions. You carry a lot for someone traveling alone, Beatrice observed, her voice still hoarse from screaming. I am always prepared to be far from town, Dalton replied without looking at her. Towns are not places that welcome me. Because you are Apache. He glanced at her then, something sharp in his gaze. Half Apache. My mother was Chiricahua. My father was a fur trapper from Missouri. Neither world claimed me fully, so I learned to claim myself. Beatrice understood that loneliness, that sense of belonging nowhere. The town cast me out because I loved a man who died before he could make me respectable. We are both exiles then. Dalton stirred the pot, adding what looked like dried herbs from a pouch. Exiles can survive where the accepted cannot. We learn to see clearly. We learn what matters. The baby finished nursing and made a small sound of contentment. Beatrice lifted her to her shoulder, patting her back gently until a tiny burp emerged. She smiled despite everything, despite the pain and exhaustion and uncertainty. I have not even named her yet. What will you call her? Beatrice looked down at the small face, the dark eyes that seemed to look right through her. Grace, because I was given none, but she will have it. She will have everything I did not. Dalton nodded slowly. Grace, it is a good name. A name with weight. He poured the heated water into a wooden cup and brought it to her. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the scent of something earthy and slightly bitter. Drink, it will help your body heal. Beatrice took the cup and sipped carefully. The liquid was warm and soothing, coating her throat. She had no idea what was in it, but she trusted this man who had saved her life. Where did you learn to deliver babies? My mother taught me many things before she died. Apache women know the ways of birth and death. They do not flinch from either. He paused, his jaw tightening. She died bringing my sister into the world. The baby died too. I was 10 years old. After that, my father could not look at me. I reminded him of what he had lost. He left me with a mission priest and disappeared into the mountains. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, buried deep, but Beatrice heard it nonetheless. I am sorry. It was a long time ago. Dalton returned to the fire and began preparing something else, working with his hands to avoid her gaze. The priest taught me to read and write. He thought he could civilize the savage out of me. But when I was 15, Apache raiders attacked a nearby ranch. The rancher's son blamed me, said I had helped them plan it. I had not, but my word meant nothing. They would have hanged me if the priest had not helped me escape. Beatrice felt a surge of anger on his behalf. So you have been running ever since. Not running, surviving. There's a difference. He looked at her directly now. I hunt. I trap. I trade with the few who will trade with me. I live in the spaces between worlds. It is not the life I imagined as a child, but it is mine. Grace began to fuss, and Beatrice rocked her gently, humming a melody her own mother had sung to her in what felt like another lifetime. Dalton watched them, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and gathered his rifle from where it leaned against a rock. I am going to hunt. We need food. Real food, not just dried meat. You will stay here, rest, regain your strength. What if someone comes? No one comes here. This place is sacred to my mother's people. They avoid it out of respect. The white settlers think it is cursed because 2 prospectors died here years ago. Drank bad water and poisoned themselves. He checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. You are safe here. The fire will keep animals away. I will return before midday. He left without another word, moving silently into the brush and disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Beatrice sat alone with her daughter, listening to the sounds of the canyon. Birds called to each other in the cottonwoods. The spring sang its endless song. Grace slept against her chest, her tiny heart beating like a drum. For the first time since James died, Beatrice allowed herself to feel something other than grief and fear. She felt possibility. She felt the faint stirring of hope. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, had given her life. Had given her daughter life. The question now was what she would do with that gift. She looked down at Grace's sleeping face and made a silent promise. I will not let you grow up ashamed. I will not let you carry the weight of other people's judgment. We will find a way to live. You and I, we will find a way to be free. The sun climbed higher, warming the canyon. Beatrice carefully stood and walked to the spring, kneeling at its edge. The water was crystal clear, cold enough to make her gasp when she splashed it on her face. She could see smooth stones at the bottom, see tiny fish darting between them. She cupped water in her hands and drank deeply. The coldness shocking and wonderful after the heat of yesterday. She returned to the fire and lay Grace on the deerskin blanket, unwrapping her to check her over more thoroughly in the daylight. 10 fingers, 10 toes, all accounted for. No signs of distress or illness. The umbilical cord had been tied off expertly with what looked like sinew. Dalton's work, careful and precise. Grace stretched and yawned, her tiny fists uncurling. Beatrice rewrapped her and held her close, staring into the flames. She thought about redemption flats, about the women who had turned their backs. about the men who had watched her struggle past without lifting a finger. She thought about Mrs. Pritchard's cold eyes, about Hodge pointing toward the desert like he was sentencing her to death. And she realized something fundamental had shifted inside her. She was not the same woman who had walked out of that town yesterday. That woman had been beaten down by grief and circumstance, had believed on some level that she deserved the punishment the world was giving her. This woman, sitting by a fire with her newborn daughter, knew better. She had survived. She had brought life into the world in the most brutal conditions imaginable.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
She was stronger than they had ever given her credit for. Stronger than she had given herself credit for. The sound of footsteps brought her head up sharply. But it was Dalton, emerging from the brush with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder and a canvas bag that looked full. He knelt by the fire and began preparing the rabbits with swift, efficient movements, skinning and cleaning them without waste. He buried the remains away from the camp, then spitted the meat and set it over the flames. I also found wild onions and some prickly pear fruit, he said, opening the bag to show her. Not much, but enough to give you strength. You did not have to do all this. Yes, I did. He turned the spit, the meat already beginning to sizzle and brown. You saved a life yesterday. Your daughter's. That takes courage. It deserves to be honored. They ate in companionable silence when the food was ready. The rabbit was tough but flavorful, seasoned with herbs Dalton had gathered. The prickly pear was sweet and strange on Beatrice's tongue. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling strength seep back into her limbs with each mouthful. Grace slept through it all, oblivious to everything except warmth and milk and the sound of her mother's heartbeat. When they finished eating, Dalton cleaned the camp methodically, burying the bones and remains, scattering the ashes. We cannot stay here forever, he said finally, not looking at her. You need shelter. Real shelter, medicine, things I cannot provide alone in the wilderness. I cannot go back to that town. I know. He sat across from her, his dark eyes steady. There's a settlement 3 days' ride north. Smaller than Redemption Flats. A mining camp, mostly rough men, but they have a doctor. A woman there runs a boarding house. She might take you in if you work for your keep. You would take us there. I would see you safely delivered, yes. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I cannot stay. Places like that, someone always recognizes me eventually. Someone always decides I do not belong. It ends badly. Beatrice felt something twist in her chest, an unexpected pang of loss. This man had saved her life, had shown her more kindness in one night than the entire town of Redemption Flats had shown her in months. The thought of losing that, of facing the world alone again, terrified her. But she understood. He was offering her a chance, maybe her only chance, to build something resembling a normal life. When would we leave? Tomorrow morning. You need 1 more day to recover. The journey will be hard, even on horseback. I will need to leave you here for a few hours this afternoon. There is a ranch 10 miles west. They owe me for some tracking work I did last season. I can trade for a horse and saddle. You would do that for us. Dalton's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your daughter deserves a chance. So do you. He stood and checked the position of the sun. I will be back before dark. Keep the fire going. Do not wander from the canyon. He left again, moving with that same ghost-like silence. Beatrice watched him go, then looked down at Grace, who had woken and was staring up at her with those impossibly dark eyes. We are going to be all right, she whispered. I do not know how yet, but we are going to survive this. The afternoon passed slowly. Beatrice dozed in the shade of the cottonwoods, Grace sleeping on her chest. She woke once to the sound of a hawk crying overhead, circled by smaller birds driving it away from their nests. She woke again to Grace's hungry cries and fed her, marveling at how something so small could demand so much and give so much at the same time. True to his word, Dalton returned as the sun was setting, leading a sturdy paint mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle demeanor. The horse was laden with supplies, a bedroll, canvas bags bulging with goods. "Her name is Rain," Dalton said, stroking the mare's neck. "She is sure-footed and calm. She will carry you both safely." Beatrice approached slowly, letting Rain sniff her hand. The mare's nose was soft as velvet. "She is beautiful. She is practical. Beauty is secondary." But there was a hint of warmth in Dalton's voice, a suggestion that he cared more than he let on. He began unpacking the supplies. "I have blankets, food for the journey, a water skin, cloth for the baby. Everything we will need." That night, they sat together by the fire again, the flames dancing between them. Grace slept in her makeshift cradle of deerskin and blankets. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Dalton told her about the northern settlement, about the woman who ran the boarding house, a widow named Margaret, who had a reputation for fairness. Beatrice told him about James, about their brief happiness, about the dreams they had shared. "He would be grateful to you," she said quietly. "For saving us." Dalton stared into the flames. "I did what anyone should have done. The shame belongs to those who did not." Beatrice reached across the space between them and touched his hand briefly. It was the first time she had initiated contact, and she felt him tense, then relax. "You are a good man, Dalton. Whatever the world has told you, whatever you have been made to believe about yourself, you are good." He did not respond, but he did not pull away either. They sat like that for a long moment, connected by nothing more than a touch and shared understanding of what it meant to be cast out, to be judged, to survive anyway. Then Dalton gently withdrew his hand and stood. "Sleep. Tomorrow we ride." Beatrice lay down with Grace beside her, wrapped in blankets that smelled of leather and smoke. She watched Dalton settle against his boulder, rifle across his lap, keeping watch as he had the night before. And as she drifted into sleep, she thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. How cruelty and kindness could exist in the same world. How sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. How perhaps, just perhaps, she and Grace were meant to survive after all. The journey north began at first light, when the desert was still cool and forgiving. Dalton had fashioned a sling from soft leather and cloth that allowed Beatrice to carry Grace against her chest while keeping her hands free to hold the reins. Rain moved with a steady, patient gait, as if she understood the fragility of her cargo. Dalton walked ahead on foot, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. They traveled through country that shifted from red desert to rocky foothills, following game trails and dried waterways that only Dalton seemed able to read. He moved through the landscape like he was part of it, pausing occasionally to check the horizon or examine tracks in the dust. Twice he led them off the main path to avoid what he said were recent signs of riders, though Beatrice saw nothing but disturbed earth. By midday, the heat had grown oppressive. Dalton called a halt in the shade of a massive boulder that cast a wedge of shadow across the trail. He helped Beatrice down from the saddle, his hand steadying her when her legs trembled from hours of riding. Grace had been mercifully quiet, sleeping through most of the morning, lulled by the rhythm of Rain's steps. "We rest here for 2 hours, Dalton said, offering her the water skin. "The worst heat passes, then we continue. We should reach the foothills by nightfall." Beatrice drank gratefully and settled into the shade, unwrapping Grace to check her. The baby's skin was warm, but not fevered, her color good. She nursed hungrily while Dalton tended to Rain, checking her hooves and offering her water from his hat. He moved with the same careful attention he gave everything, wasting no motion, missing no detail. "You care for that horse like she is family," Beatrice observed. She has carried me through country that would kill most men. She has never faltered, never refused. That earns respect. He ran his hand along Rain's flank, and the Mare leaned into his touch. Animals are honest. They do not pretend to be what they are not. They do not judge you for blood or circumstance. They simply are. You prefer them to people. I prefer honesty to lies. If that means I prefer animals, so be it. He moved to sit near her, but not too close, maintaining the careful distance he always kept. People see what they want to see. They make up stories about you and then punish you for not living up to their fiction. Animals see only what is real. Beatrice adjusted Grace in her arms, thinking about his words. The town made up a story about me. They decided I was a fallen woman, a sinner, someone deserving of punishment. Nothing I said mattered. The truth did not matter. The truth rarely does when people have already decided what they want to believe. Dalton pulled out some dried meat and broke it in half, offering her a portion. My mother told me once that the Apache have a saying. A man is not defined by what others call him, but by what he does when no one is watching. You walked into the desert alone to birth your child rather than beg from people who had already condemned you. That defines you. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. Bravery and terror are not opposites. They are companions. One does not exist without the other. He chewed slowly, his gaze distant. The first time I killed a man, I was 17. He was a drunk who decided I had looked at his daughter wrong. He came at me with a knife. I shot him. My hands shook so badly afterward I could not reload. But I had done what needed to be done. Beatrice studied his face, seeing the weight of that memory in the lines around his eyes. Do you regret it? I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret surviving. He met her gaze. You will face more moments like the one in that town. More people who want to punish you for imagined sins. You will have to decide each time whether to bend to their judgment or stand against it. Grace will be watching. She will learn from what she sees you do. The words settled over Beatrice like a mantle, heavy with responsibility but also with purpose. She looked down at her daughter, at the tiny perfect face that trusted her completely. Then I will teach her that she bows to no one. That her worth is not determined by what others think. That she defines herself. Dalton nodded slowly. Good. The world needs more women who know their own strength. They rested in silence after that, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. Grace fell back asleep, her small body relaxed and trusting. Beatrice dozed fitfully, her body still recovering from the trauma of birth. When Dalton finally stirred and announced it was time to move on, she felt stiff and sore, but she climbed back into the saddle without complaint. The afternoon stretched long and dusty. They climbed gradually into higher country where pinyon pines began to appear among the rocks and the air carried the sharp scent of juniper. Dalton maintained his position ahead of them, his attention never wavering. Once, he held up a hand for them to stop, then moved forward alone to investigate something Beatrice could not see. He returned a few minutes later and gestured for them to continue, offering no explanation as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They crested a rise and Beatrice saw their destination. A narrow valley opened below them, green with cottonwoods that marked the presence of water. Smoke rose from several scattered buildings, and she could hear the faint sound of hammering, the distant bray of a mule. It was not much, just a rough collection of structures clinging to the hillside, but after the emptiness of the desert, it looked like civilization. Silver Creek, Dalton said, his voice neutral. Not much to look at, but the water is good and the silver played out years ago, so most of the troublemakers moved on. What is left is mostly farmers and a few stubborn miners who refuse to admit defeat. And the woman you mentioned. Margaret. Her place is the large building at the north end. White paint, green shutters. You cannot miss it. He paused, his jaw tightening. I will take you to her door. After that, you are on your own. It is better that way." Beatrice felt that twist in her chest again, sharper now. "Will you at least stay the night? Rest before you go." "No, it is better I leave before anyone asks too many questions." He started down the slope, and Rain followed without needing to be led. "Margaret will help you if you are honest with her. Tell her your story. She has no patience for lies, but she respects courage." They descended into the valley as twilight deepened into dusk. Oil lamps began to glow in windows. A dog barked somewhere, and voices carried on the evening air. Beatrice felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. New place, new people, new judgments waiting to be made. But this time she had Grace, and she had survived the desert. Whatever came next, she would face it. Dalton led them through the outskirts of the settlement, avoiding the main street. They passed a few scattered cabins, a small barn, a chicken coop where hens settled in for the night. No one seemed to notice them in the gathering darkness. Finally, they reached the boarding house, exactly as Dalton had described it. The building was well maintained, the paint fresh, the shutters straight. Light glowed warmly from the windows, and Beatrice could smell bread baking. Dalton helped her down from the saddle one last time, his hands careful and respectful. He untied the bundles of supplies he had secured behind the saddle and set them at her feet. "Everything you need is here. Food, blankets, a little money I had saved. It is not much, but it will see you through until you find work." Beatrice stared at the bundles, then up at him. "You have given me everything. I have no way to repay you. I do not want repayment. I want you and Grace to live. That is enough." He stepped back, creating distance between them again. "Go now, knock on that door. Tell Margaret that Dalton sent you and that you need help. Use my name. She will remember me. Wait." Beatrice shifted Grace in her arms and reached out, catching his hand before he could move away. "I do not even know your full name. If Grace asks about you someday, what do I tell her?" Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or pain. "Dalton is enough. It is the only name that has ever been truly mine. Then I will. Tell her about Dalton, the man who saved our lives when everyone else turned away. I will tell her that there is still goodness in this world, even when it feels like there is none left." Beatrice squeezed his hand once, then released it. "Thank you. For everything." Dalton nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. Then he turned to Rain, running his hand along her neck one last time. "Take care of them, old girl," he murmured. To Beatrice, he said, "She is yours now. She will serve you well." Before Beatrice could respond, before she could find words adequate to the moment, Dalton melted into the shadows between the buildings. One moment he was there, solid and real, and the next he was gone, as if he had never existed at all. Only the horse and the supplies and the memory of his steady presence remained. Beatrice stood alone in the street, Grace sleeping against her chest, surrounded by everything Dalton had given them. She felt the weight of his absence like a physical thing, an unexpected grief for someone she had known less than 2 days, but who had changed everything. Then she straightened her spine, gathered the bundles as best she could, and walked up. The steps to Margaret's door, she knocked 3 times firm and clear. Footsteps approached from inside, and then the door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple dress with an apron, flour dusting her hands. Her gaze swept over Beatrice, taking in her ragged appearance, the baby, the supplies, the horse standing patient in the street. "I do not take charity cases," the woman said bluntly. "I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work. A place to sleep in exchange for labor." Beatrice met the woman's eyes without flinching. "Dalton sent me. He said you were fair." At the mention of Dalton's name, something shifted in the woman's expression. Her eyes narrowed, studying Beatrice more carefully. "Dalton sent you, did he? Where is he now?" "Gone. He said it was better that way. Smart man. Always was. Margaret stepped back from the door. Come inside before you fall over. You look half dead. Beatrice climbed the steps and entered the boarding house. The interior was clean and spare but comfortable, with a large common room dominated by a stone fireplace. The smell of baking bread was stronger here, mixed with the scent of coffee and wood smoke. 3 men sat at a long table, playing cards and drinking from tin cups. They looked up as Beatrice entered, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Back to your game, Margaret said sharply. This does not concern you. The men returned to their cards, but Beatrice felt their eyes following her as Margaret led her through to a small room off the kitchen. It was simple, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair, but it was clean and the window let in fresh air. Margaret gestured for her to sit. Let me see the baby, she said, not unkindly. Beatrice unwrapped Grace and held her out. Margaret took the infant with practiced hands, examining her with the efficiency of someone who had seen many babies. She checked Grace's color, her breathing, the healing umbilical cord. Healthy enough, born recently, 2 days ago. In the desert, Margaret's eyebrows rose. The desert? Alone, not by choice. The town forced me out. Beatrice met the older woman's gaze squarely. They said I was not decent. My husband died before we could register our marriage. I was pregnant and alone, so they cast me out too. Margaret was silent for a long moment, still holding Grace. And Dalton found you. He broke down the door of the shack where I was dying. He delivered my daughter. He brought us here. Beatrice's voice wavered slightly. He gave us a chance when no one else would. That sounds like him. Margaret handed Grace back gently. He has a habit of saving things people have thrown away. Injured animals, broken tools, inconvenient women. He once carried a half-dead wolf cub for 3 days until he found someone who would nurse it. The man cannot resist a lost cause. I am not lost. No, I do not suppose you are. Anyone who survives childbirth in the desert has steel in them. Margaret crossed her arms. Here is what I offer. You can stay in this room. You will help with cooking, cleaning, laundry, whatever needs doing. In exchange, you get room and board for you and the child. No pay for the first month while you recover your strength. After that, we can discuss wages. These terms are not negotiable. Beatrice felt relief wash through her so strongly she almost wept. I accept. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. The work is hard and the men are rough, though I keep them in line. You will earn every meal. Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. I do not care about your past or what you did or did not do. Everyone here is running from something. I care about what you do under my roof. You work hard, you keep your head down, you raise that baby right, and we will have no problems. Understood. Understood. Good. There is stew on the stove and bread just out of the oven. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow you start earning your keep. Margaret left. Pulling the door shut behind her, Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, Grace in her arms, and looked around the small room that was now theirs. It was not much, but it was shelter. It was safety. It was a chance to build something from the wreckage of her old life. Outside, night had fully fallen, and somewhere in that darkness, Dalton was moving through country only he knew, carrying his solitude like a familiar burden, she thought. About his words, about defining yourself rather than being defined by others. She thought about his hands, gentle despite their roughness, bringing her daughter into the world. She thought about how quickly a life could change, how one moment of kindness could alter everything that came after. Grace stirred and whimpered. And Beatrice brought her to her breast, settling back against the thin pillow. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the common room, the clink of dishes, the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. She was part of something again, however tentatively. She had a roof over her head and food. In her belly and a daughter who depended on her. We made it. she whispered to Grace. "We survived. And tomorrow we start building something new." But even as she said the words, even as relief and exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, part of her mind remained in the desert, in a canyon where a fire burned and a man with haunted eyes watched over them through the night. She wondered where he was sleeping tonight. She wondered if he was safe. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if he would remain forever a ghost, a savior who appeared and vanished like smoke. Grace fell asleep at her breast, milk-drunk and content. Beatrice carefully laid her in the center of the bed, building a nest of blankets around her to keep her from rolling. Then she stood and moved to the window, looking out at the settlement. Lights glowed in scattered windows. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Somewhere out there, Dalton was alone under those same stars, and Beatrice sent a silent prayer into the darkness that he would find whatever peace a man like him could find in this harsh world. She turned back to the bed, to her sleeping daughter, to the small room that represented a new beginning. And as she finally allowed herself to rest, as sleep claimed her exhausted body and wounded heart, she carried with her the memory of a man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return. A man who had taught her, in 2 short days, that survival was not just about living, but about choosing who you became in the aftermath of tragedy. 3 weeks had passed since Beatrice arrived at Margaret's boarding house, and she had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost normal. She woke before dawn to help with breakfast, feeding Grace in the quiet darkness before the miners and farmhands stumbled down for their morning meal. Her days were filled with washing linens, scrubbing floors, preparing meals, and tending to the endless needs of the men who paid Margaret for room and board. Her hands, once soft, had grown calloused and strong. Her body, still recovering from childbirth, had adapted to the relentless work. Grace thrived in ways that astonished Beatrice. The baby had grown noticeably, her cheeks rounding out, her limbs filling with healthy weight. She smiled now, real smiles that lit up her entire face, and she had begun making sounds beyond simple crying, coos and gurgles that seemed almost conversational. Margaret had fashioned a cradle from an old apple crate, lined with soft blankets. And Grace spent her days in the kitchen where Beatrice could watch her while she worked. The men who boarded at the house had been wary of Beatrice at first, their eyes full of questions they knew better than to ask. Margaret ruled her establishment with an iron hand, and she had made it clear from the first morning that Beatrice was under her protection. Any man who made trouble would find himself sleeping in the street, no refund offered. The warning had been unnecessary. Most of the men were decent enough, weary from hard labor and grateful for hot food and clean beds. A few had even taken to bringing small gifts for Grace. A carved wooden rattle, a soft rabbit's foot, a handful of wildflowers, but Silver Creek was not Redemption Flats. And news traveled slowly in mining country. Beatrice had begun to believe she might actually build a life here, might escape the judgment that had nearly killed her. That belief shattered on a Tuesday morning when 3 riders came up the main street, dust billowing behind their horses. Beatrice was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the commotion. Voices raised in the street, the sound of boots on wooden planks, doors opening as people emerged to see what the fuss was about. She set down the wet sheet she had been pinning and moved toward the front of the house, Grace sleeping in her sling against her chest. The 3 men had dismounted in front of the general store. They were rough-looking, unshaven, their clothes stained with travel and sweat. But it was the man in the center who made Beatrice's blood run cold. Silas Pritchard, the banker's son from Redemption Flats. She had not known him well, but she recognized his sharp features, his calculating eyes, the way he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. "We are looking for a woman," Silas called out, his voice carrying across the street. "Beatrice Morgan. She ran off from Redemption Flats owing debts." Anyone seen her? Beatrice stepped back into the shadow of the house, her heart hammering. Debts. It was a lie, a convenient fiction to justify hunting her down. But why? What could they possibly want from her? Margaret appeared at her elbow, having heard the commotion. She took one look at Beatrice's face and understood immediately. "Inside," she whispered. "Now, go to your room and stay there." Beatrice did not argue. She slipped through the back door and hurried to her room, closing the door as quietly as she could. Grace stirred against her chest, sensing her mother's fear. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm her breathing, trying to think through the thin walls. She heard Margaret's boots on the porch, heard her voice ring out strong and clear. "Can I help you, gentlemen? We are looking for someone," Silas replied. Beatrice could hear the false pleasantness in his tone, the veneer of civility over something darker. A woman named Beatrice Morgan. Red hair, traveling with an infant.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"We have information she might have come this way. Plenty of women pass through here. Mining camps attract all kinds." Margaret's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "What makes you think this particular woman would be in Silver Creek? Someone saw her traveling north with a half-breed guide a few weeks back. We tracked them this far before we lost the trail." Silas paused. "The woman stole property from her deceased husband's family. We are here to bring her back to face justice." More lies. James had no family except an elderly mother in Kansas who had disowned him for marrying beneath his station. But Beatrice understood now. This was not about debts or theft. This was about control. About a town that could not tolerate the idea of a woman escaping their judgment. Surviving on her own terms, even if I had seen this woman. "Which I have not," Margaret said slowly. "I would need to see some kind of legal documentation. A warrant, perhaps. Something official. We do not need a warrant for a thief, in my experience. Men who claim they do not need warrants are usually men who could not get one." Margaret's voice hardened. "Now you can stable your horses at the livery down the street and get a meal at the saloon. But this is a boarding house for working men, not a hotel for bounty hunters. Move along." There was a long, tense silence. Then Silas spoke again, and this time the false pleasantness was gone. "This woman is dangerous. She abandoned her responsibilities, fled into the desert with a bastard child. She corrupts everything she touches. If you are hiding her, you are making a mistake. The only mistake I see is 3 men wasting their time in my yard instead of moving along like I asked." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "Good day, gentlemen." Beatrice heard boots retreating, heard the creak of saddle leather as the men mounted up. But she also heard Silas's final words, pitched loud enough to carry. "We will find her. This town is not that big. And when we do, anyone who helped her will answer for it." Then the sound of hooves, moving away but not leaving, just relocating. Beatrice pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. They were not going to give up. They would search every building, question every resident. It was only a matter of time before someone pointed them in the right direction. Margaret entered the room without knocking, her face grim. "We have a problem," I heard. "I am sorry. I will leave. I will not bring trouble to your door. You will do no such thing." Margaret crossed her arms. "Those men are not here for justice. Any fool can see that. But they are here, and they are not leaving empty-handed. We need a plan." "What kind of plan?" Before Margaret could answer, one of the boarders, a grizzled miner named Thomas who had been kind to Grace, appeared in the doorway. "Begging your pardon, Miss Margaret, but I could not help overhearing. Those men asking about the girl, what about them? I recognize that fancy-talking one. Silas Pritchard. He used to run a claim-jumping operation down in Arizona Territory before the law ran him out. He is no banker's son, no matter what he claims. He is a con man and a bully." Thomas looked at Beatrice with something like sympathy. "Whatever he says you did, I would bet my last dollar it is horseshit." Pardon my language, Margaret's eyes narrowed. Can you prove any of this? Not in a way that would hold up in any court. But I know what I know, Thomas scratched his beard. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles east, abandoned but still got good supports. She could hide there with the baby until those men move on. They will search the mines, not this one. It is on private property, belongs to Old Man Carson. He does not take kindly to trespassers, and he has got the temperament and the shotgun to back it up. Those city boys would not dare. Beatrice shook her head. I cannot keep running. I cannot spend my life hiding in mine shafts and desert shacks. There has to be another way. There is, Margaret said slowly, an idea forming behind her eyes. We make them leave. How? By giving them what they think they want, but not actually giving them anything at all. Margaret turned to Thomas. Can you round up some of the other men? The ones you trust. Tell them to meet me at the saloon in an hour. We are going to have a conversation with our visitors. Thomas grinned, showing gaps in his teeth. Yes, ma'am. This should be interesting. An hour later, Beatrice stood behind the curtain in Margaret's office, peering through a gap at the scene unfolding in the common room. Margaret had invited Silas and his companions inside, offering them coffee and seats at the long table. A dozen miners and farmhands had also gathered, ostensibly by coincidence, filling the room with their bulk and silent presence. Now then, Margaret said, pouring coffee with exaggerated courtesy. You mentioned you are looking for a woman. Let us discuss this civilly. Silas accepted the coffee but did not drink it. We just want what is owed. The woman stole from her late husband's estate. We have a right to recover those goods. What goods exactly? Personal items. Family heirlooms. Things of sentimental value. Funny thing about sentimental value. Thomas spoke up from his position near the door. It is awful hard to put a price on. Almost like it is made up. Silas's jaw tightened. This does not concern you. Everything that happens in this town concerns me. I am on the town council, such as it is. Thomas was lying smoothly, and Beatrice marveled at his audacity. And I make it my business to know when strangers come asking questions. Especially strangers with questionable reputations. I do not know what you think you know. I know you are Silas Pritchard, formerly of Tucson, where you ran a land scheme that cheated miners out of their claims. I know you left Arizona one step ahead of a rope. Thomas leaned forward. So when you come into my town talking about justice, I get suspicious. Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. You have no proof of any of that. Maybe not. But I have got a dozen witnesses right here who will swear they saw you threaten Miss Margaret earlier. Threatening a woman in her own home. That is serious business in these parts. Thomas glanced around the room, and every man nodded in agreement. Seems to me you have got two choices. You can leave peaceful like right now, or you can wait for the territorial marshal to show up. He is due through here in about 3 days. I am sure he would be real interested in hearing about your past. The other two men with Silas exchanged glances. They were hired guns, Beatrice realized, not true believers. They had no loyalty beyond their pay, and they were outnumbered. One of them touched Silas's arm. Maybe we should move on. The woman probably is not even here. Silas shook off the hand, his face flushed with anger. But he was smart enough to recognize when he was beaten. This is not over. If I find out you have been hiding her, then what? Margaret stood, drawing herself up to her full height. You will threaten an old woman? Burn down her business? Show your true colors to everyone in this town? Be my guest. But I promise you, it will not end the way you think. The standoff held for a long, tense moment. Then Silas turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, his companions following. At the threshold, he looked back. You are all fools. That woman is poison. She will bring nothing but trouble. Trouble, Margaret said calmly. Is men like you who cannot stand the thought of a woman surviving without your permission. Now get out of my house." The three men left, and the room remained silent until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Then Thomas let out a long breath. Well, that was bracing. Margaret went to the window and watched until she was certain they were truly gone. Then she beckoned for Beatrice to come out. Beatrice emerged from the office, Grace still sleeping against her chest, her legs unsteady. "They will come back," she said quietly. "Men like that always do, maybe, but not today, and probably not to Silver Creek." Thomas settled back into his chair. "Word will spread about what happened here. Other towns will know to watch for them. And if they are smart, they will realize chasing one woman across the territory is not worth the trouble. Why did you help me?" Beatrice looked around the room at the assembled men, these rough strangers who had stood up for her without hesitation. "You do not even know me. Do not need to know you," one of the other miners said. "We know Margaret, and we know she does not shelter bad people. That is good enough. Besides," Thomas added, "some of us know what it is like to be hunted for things that were not our fault. Miners are not exactly beloved in polite society. We look out for our own, and right now, you are one of us." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. She had been so alone for so long, carrying the weight of judgment and shame and fear. To suddenly have people stand beside her, to defend her without question, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you. I do not have words, do not need words. Just keep making those biscuits for breakfast. Best damn biscuits I have ever had." Thomas winked at her, and the tension in the room finally broke. The men began to disperse, returning to their work or their rooms. The crisis passed. Margaret put a hand on Beatrice's shoulder. "You are safe here. I meant what I said to those men. You are under my protection, and in this town, that means something. But what if they come back with a real warrant? What if they find some legal way to take me? Then we will deal with it when it happens. But I do not think they will. Men like Silas do not have the patience for legal proceedings. They want quick victories, easy prey. You are neither." Margaret squeezed her shoulder gently. "You survived childbirth in the desert. You walked away from a town that wanted you dead. You are stronger than you know, Beatrice. Trust that strength." That night, after Grace was asleep and the house had quieted, Beatrice stood at her window and looked out at the stars. She thought about Dalton, wondered where he was, whether he was safe. She wished she could tell him what had happened, thank him again for bringing her to this place where people still believed in protecting the vulnerable. She wished many things, but most of all, she wished he knew that his faith in her had been justified. She had not just survived. She was beginning to live. The next morning brought a surprise. Beatrice was kneading bread dough when Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Got something for you," he said, setting the bundle on the table. Beatrice wiped her hands on her apron and unwrapped it. Inside was a small pistol, old but well-maintained, and a box of ammunition. She looked up at Thomas in confusion. "It was my wife's," he said quietly. "She died of fever 10 years back. I have been carrying it around ever since. Could not bring myself to sell it. But I think she would want you to have it. Just in case those men come back or anyone else decides to cause trouble. I do not know how to use it. I will teach you. This afternoon, we will go out past the creek where no one will hear, and I will show you how to load it, aim it, fire it. You do not have to like guns, and I hope to God you never have to use it. But better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." Beatrice picked up the pistol. It was heavier than she expected, cold metal that warmed quickly in her hand. She had never imagined herself as someone who would carry a weapon, but then again, she had never imagined many things that had become her reality. "Thank you, Thomas. For everything. Do not mention it. Just promise me one thing. When that little girl grows up, you tell her about this. About how a whole town stood up for her mother. about how people can be good when they choose to be. The world is full of enough darkness. She should know about the light too. Beatrice looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, oblivious to the dangers that had swirled around her. I promise, she will know that goodness exists. That people like you and Margaret and Dalton are real. That choosing to help someone is never weakness, always strength. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and left her to her bread. Beatrice worked the dough with renewed purpose, her hands strong and sure. She was not the frightened woman who had stumbled out of Redemption Flats 3 weeks ago. She was not even the desperate mother who had given birth in a desert shack. She was someone new, forged by fire and survival and the unexpected kindness of strangers. And whoever came for her next, whether it was Silas or someone else, they would find her ready. 2 months had passed since Silas Pritchard and his men rode out of Silver Creek, and life had settled into something Beatrice had never dared hope for. Peace, not the fragile, temporary kind that could shatter with a word or a glance, but something deeper, something earned. She had become part of the fabric of the town, known not as the woman with the shameful past, but as the woman who made the best biscuits, who could mend a torn shirt better than anyone, who sang softly to her baby while she worked. Grace had grown into a healthy, alert infant who smiled at everyone and had begun trying to sit up on her own. The miners doted on her shamelessly, competing to see who could make her laugh the loudest. Margaret had softened in ways Beatrice had not thought possible, often holding Grace while Beatrice finished the evening dishes, humming old songs in a surprisingly sweet voice. Beatrice had learned to shoot the pistol Thomas gave her, though she kept it hidden in her room, hoping she would never need to draw it. She had also learned the rhythms of Silver Creek, the way the miners came and went with the seasons, the way the farmers gathered at the general store on Saturdays to exchange news and supplies, the way the whole town turned out when someone needed help raising a barn or bringing in a harvest. It was on a crisp October morning, with frost still clinging to the edges of the window glass, that everything changed again. Beatrice was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound that had become familiar over the months. A horse approaching at a steady pace, not hurried but purposeful. She glanced out the window and froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Dalton sat astride a different horse than the one he had left with, a sturdy buckskin gelding that looked trail-worn but strong. He dismounted slowly, his movements carrying a stiffness that had not been there before. Even from a distance, Beatrice could see he had changed. He was thinner, his face more drawn, and he favored his left side as he tied the horse to the rail. Margaret appeared at Beatrice's elbow. "Well, I will be damned. Did not think we would see him again." Beatrice was already untying her apron, her hands shaking slightly. She had thought about Dalton countless times over the past months, wondered if he was safe, if he thought of them, if she would ever have the chance to thank him properly for everything he had given them. Now he was here, and she did not know what to say or how to act. She stepped out onto the porch before he could knock. He looked up at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in her appearance, and something in his expression eased. Relief, perhaps. Or satisfaction. "You are well," he said finally, his voice rougher than she remembered. "I am. We both are, thanks to you." Beatrice descended the steps slowly. "What happened to you? You are hurt. Old wound. It is healing." He glanced past her toward the house. "I should not have come. But I was passing through the territory, and I needed to know." "Know what?" "That I had not led you into another trap. That this place was what I hoped it would be." He looked down at his hands, scarred and weathered. "I have made mistakes in my life. Left people in places I thought were safe that turned out not to be. I could not do that again." Beatrice felt something warm unfold in her chest. He had come back to check on them, to make sure they were safe. This man who claimed to prefer solitude, who kept the world at arm's length, had ridden however many miles out of his way because he cared. Come inside. You need food and rest. Whatever happened to you, you look like you have been through hell. I cannot stay long. You can stay for breakfast. Margaret will insist, and you do not argue with Margaret. Beatrice smiled, trying to lighten the moment. Besides, Grace should see you. She is old enough now to remember faces. At the mention of Grace, something flickered in Dalton's eyes. He nodded once and followed Beatrice into the house. Margaret greeted him with her usual bluntness. You look terrible. Sit down before you fall down. The morning meal was a lively affair, with the boarders peppering Dalton with questions. About his travels, about the country to the south, about whether the Apache were likely to cause trouble this winter. He answered in short, measured responses, giving away little but satisfying their curiosity enough that they eventually returned to their own conversations. Grace sat in her cradle near the table, watching Dalton with solemn attention, as if she somehow recognized him. After breakfast, when the men had dispersed to their various jobs, Beatrice brought Grace out to the porch where Dalton stood looking out at the mountains. She held the baby out to him. Would you like to hold her? He hesitated, then carefully took Grace into his arms. She was so much bigger than the tiny blood-covered infant he had delivered in the desert, but he held her with the same gentle certainty. Grace reached up and grabbed a strand of his hair, tugging experimentally. Dalton's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. She has your eyes, he said quietly. She has her father's stubbornness. She will not sleep. Unless she is exactly the right temperature. And she has very specific opinions about when she wants to eat. Beatrice sat on the porch steps. Tell me what really happened. The wound you are carrying is not old. Dalton was silent for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on Grace, who had moved on to exploring his shirt buttons. I was in Arizona territory. There was a bounty hunter, a man named Creech. He had a warrant for an Apache man accused of killing a rancher. The warrant was fake, the killing was self-defense, but Creech did not care about truth. He cared about the reward. You helped the man escape. I tried. Creech found us. There was a fight. Dalton shifted his weight, and Beatrice saw him wince. Creech got a knife into my side before I put him down. The Apache man made it across the border into Mexico. I did not. You killed the bounty hunter. I did what was necessary. His voice was flat, but Beatrice heard the weight behind it. Then I rode north before anyone could connect me to it. I have been moving ever since, staying ahead of anyone who might have questions. Beatrice felt a surge of anger on his behalf. You saved someone's life, and now you are the one running. That is not justice. Justice is a luxury for people who can afford it. People like me, we survive in the cracks where justice does not reach. He looked down at Grace, his expression softening. But seeing you here, seeing her healthy and safe, that is its own kind of justice. The good kind. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron. I hate to interrupt, but there is something you both should know. That man who was looking for Beatrice a few months back, Silas Pritchard, word came up from Redemption Flats last week. He got himself shot in a card game in Tucson. He is alive, but barely. Will not be hunting anyone for a long time. Beatrice felt a weight she had not realized she was still carrying suddenly lift. He cannot come back, not him, and probably not anyone else from that town. Seems like once he was gone, people started asking questions about why he was so obsessed with finding you. Turns out he had been courting you before you married James, and you turned him down. The whole death story was just his wounded pride looking for revenge, Margaret snorted. Men and their damn egos. Dalton handed Grace back to Beatrice. Then you are truly safe here. That is good. Where will you go now? Beatrice asked, trying to keep her voice steady. North, I think. Canada, maybe. The territory's up. There are still wild enough that a man can disappear if he wants to. He started down the steps, moving toward his horse. Wait, Beatrice stood, Grace in her arms. You do not have to keep running. You could stay here. Silver Creek is not Redemption Flats. People here do not judge by blood or past mistakes. They judge by character, and yours is better than anyone I have ever met." Dalton paused, his hand on the saddle. "You do not know me well enough to say that. I know you saved my life when you could have ridden past. I know you delivered my daughter with your own hands and asked for nothing in return. I know you came back to make sure we were safe when you could have just kept riding." Beatrice descended the steps, closing the distance between them. "I know that Grace and I are alive because of you, and that means I know everything I need to know." He turned to face her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between the solitude he had built around himself and something else, something that wanted connection but did not know how to accept it. "I am not good at staying in one place." "Then stay for a little while, just until your wound heals properly. Margaret has an empty room in the back, and we could use another set of hands around here." Beatrice shifted Grace to her other hip. "And maybe, if you stay long enough, you will realize that you do not have to spend your whole life alone." Margaret called from the porch. "The girl has a point. Winter is coming, and the mountains are no place for a wounded man. Stay through the cold months at least. You can leave come spring if you want." Dalton looked between them. These two women who had no reason to care about him but did anyway. Beatrice saw the moment he made his decision, saw the tension leave his shoulders. "Through the winter only. I am not making any promises beyond that. That is all we are asking," Beatrice said, unable to keep the relief and joy from her voice. The weeks that followed were the happiest Beatrice could remember. Dalton took the small room at the back of the house, the one that had previously served as storage. He worked alongside Thomas and the other men, doing repairs around the property, hunting to supplement the food stores for winter, teaching Beatrice more about shooting and tracking. He was quiet and kept to himself most of the time, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to thaw. Beatrice caught him playing with Grace one afternoon, making faces that sent the baby into peals of laughter. She saw him sit with Margaret in the evenings, the two of them discussing books she had not known he could read. She noticed the way the other boarders began to seek his advice on practical matters, the way he became part of the household without ever claiming space or demanding attention. Winter came hard and fast, with snow that buried the town for days at a time. The boarding house became a cocoon of warmth and firelight, the common room filled with the sound of conversation and laughter. On Christmas Eve, Margaret produced a small wooden doll she had carved for Grace, painted with careful detail. Thomas contributed a set of copper bells that jingled when shaken. And Dalton, who had said nothing about having a gift, presented Beatrice with a pair of deerskin gloves, perfectly fitted, lined with rabbit fur. "For when you hang the laundry in winter," he said simply. But Beatrice saw the care that had gone into making them, the hours of work represented by each careful stitch. "They are beautiful." "Thank you." She pulled them on, flexing her fingers. They fit perfectly, warming her hands immediately. "You did not have to." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. Then he turned away, returning to his place by the fire. As winter deepened, Beatrice found herself watching Dalton more and more, noticing the way he moved, the rare smiles that crossed his face when he thought no one was looking, the gentle way he handled Grace, the quiet strength that radiated from him. She recognized the feeling growing in her chest, had felt it once before with James, but this was different. Deeper, maybe. More hard-won. One night in late January, when Grace had finally fallen asleep after a fussy evening and the house was quiet, Beatrice found Dalton on the back porch despite the cold, looking up at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him. "Cannot sleep?" she asked, thinking. He did not elaborate, and she did not press. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, their breath visible in the frigid air. Then Beatrice spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I know you said you would leave in the spring. I know you are not a man who makes promises about the future. But I need you to know something." He turned to look at her, waiting. "When I was in that shack dying, I thought my story was over. I thought Grace and I would just be forgotten. 2 more casualties of a world that did not care about people like us." She pulled the blanket tighter. "But you changed that. You gave us a chance at a different story. And now, standing here, I realize I do not want to write that story without you in it." Dalton was silent for so long she thought he might not respond at all. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm despite the cold, solid, and real. "I have spent most of my life convinced I did not deserve peace. That men like me, caught between worlds, we are meant to wander, to never belong anywhere, and now I am starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe belonging is not something you are born into. Maybe it is something you build, piece by piece, with people who see you for who you are and choose you anyway." He looked down at their joined hands. "You and Grace, this place. It feels like something I could build a life around. If you would have me." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "We would have you. We already do." He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her with a care that spoke of how precious he found her. She leaned into his warmth, into the steady beat of his heart, and felt the last pieces of her broken world click back together. Not the same as before, but something new, something stronger for having been shattered and remade. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. Wildflowers began to push through the mud, splashes of color against the drab landscape. The miners returned to their claims with renewed hope. Life stirred and stretched and remembered how to grow on a warm April morning, with the sun bright and the air sweet with possibility. Beatrice stood in the yard behind Margaret's boarding house, wearing a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Grace, now almost a year old and toddling everywhere with determined purpose, wore a white dress with yellow flowers embroidered on the hem. Margaret had closed the boarding house for the day, and every resident past and present had gathered to witness something rare and precious. The traveling preacher who made rounds through the territory stood before Beatrice and Dalton, his Bible open, his voice carrying across the yard. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Beatrice looked up at Dalton, at this man who had saved her life, who had stayed when he could have left, who had chosen her and Grace when the world had cast them aside. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she saw her own joy reflected there. The ceremony was simple, the words ancient and familiar. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute and affirming. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas let out a whoop that startled Grace into laughter. The gathered crowd cheered and clapped, and Dalton kissed Beatrice with a tenderness that made her heart swell. That evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Margaret pulled Beatrice aside. "You have come a long way from that frightened girl who showed up on my doorstep. I had help. More than I deserved. You deserved every bit of it. You fought for your life, for your daughter's life. You earned this happiness." Margaret glanced over at Dalton, who was holding Grace while she tried to pull his hair. "Take care of each other. The world is still hard, still cruel in places. But you have found something good. Hold on to it. I will. I promise." As the sun set and the stars began to emerge, Beatrice stood with her husband and daughter, surrounded by people who had become family. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and terror and loss, but also the unexpected grace, the kindness of strangers, the resilience she had not known she possessed. She had been cast out by a town that called itself decent, left to die in the desert for the crime of being vulnerable. But she had survived. more than survived. She had found love, community, purpose. She had found herself. Grace reached for her, and Beatrice took her daughter into her arms, feeling Dalton's hand settle warm on her back. The three of them stood together as darkness fell and the desert cooled, as the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. They were a family now, not bound by blood alone, but by choice, by sacrifice, by the simple, profound act of seeing each other and deciding to stay. The world beyond Silver Creek would continue its cruelty, would continue to judge and condemn and cast out. But here, in this small corner of the territory, in this house built on kindness and defended by courage, they had created something the world could not touch. They had created home. 2 years later, the summer of 1884 arrived in Silver Creek with a gentleness that seemed impossible after the harsh winters Beatrice had weathered. The boarding house had expanded, a new wing added to accommodate the growing number of travelers seeking Margaret's hospitality and Beatrice's cooking, which had become something of a legend in the territory. The garden behind the house flourished under Dalton's careful tending. Rows of vegetables and herbs that fed not just the household, but half the town. Grace was nearly 3 years old now. A whirlwind of energy and curiosity with her mother's red hair and her father's steady dark eyes. She spoke in full sentences, asked endless questions, and had appointed herself the official greeter of every guest who arrived at the boarding house. She had no memory of the desperate beginning of her life, knew nothing of desert shacks or towns that cast people out. She knew only love, safety, and the absolute certainty that she belonged. Beatrice stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching Grace chase chickens in the yard while Dalton pretended to help, but mostly laughed at her determined pursuit. The baby inside her kicked hard, as if protesting being left out of the fun. This pregnancy had been different from the first, wanted and celebrated, surrounded by people who asked after her and brought gifts for the coming child. No shame, no fear, only joy. "You are going to wear a hole in that floor if you keep pacing," Margaret said from her seat at the kitchen table, where she was shelling peas with practiced efficiency. "I am not pacing. I am standing. You have been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes, watching them like they might disappear if you look away." Margaret's tone was dry but affectionate. "They are not going anywhere. Dalton built that addition himself, bought the land next to the boarding house with money from his trapping. That man has put down roots deeper than any tree." Beatrice smiled, unable to deny it. Dalton had changed in ways she suspected even he had not anticipated. He still took hunting trips into the mountains, still needed solitude occasionally, but he always came back. Always. The boarding house was home now, in a way she suspected nowhere else had ever been for him. The townspeople had come to respect him, even rely on him. When disputes arose, they often asked for his opinion. When children got lost in the foothills, he was the first one they called to track them. "I never thought I would have this," Beatrice said quietly. "A home. A family. People who know my story and do not care. It still feels like a dream sometimes. It is not a dream. It is what you built from the wreckage." Margaret set down the bowl of peas. "That town tried to bury you, and instead you bloomed. Never forget that." A commotion at the front of the house drew their attention. Voices, the sound of boots on the porch, then Thomas burst into the kitchen with unusual urgency. "Miss Margaret, Beatrice, you need to come see this." Beatrice exchanged a glance with Margaret, then followed Thomas to the front porch. A small crowd had gathered in the street, and more people were emerging from shops and houses, all staring at something down the main road. Beatrice shaded her eyes against the sun and saw what had captured everyone's attention. A wagon was approaching, piled high with belongings, pulled by 2 tired horses. But it was the people walking alongside the wagon that made Beatrice's breath catch. Women, 5 of them, in various stages of pregnancy or carrying infants. Their clothes were worn, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something else. Fear. Behind them walked an older woman, tall and stern-faced, holding a shotgun like she knew how to use it. The wagon stopped in front of the boarding house, as if drawn there by instinct or information. The older woman stepped forward, her eyes scanning the faces on the porch until they landed on Beatrice. "We are looking for Beatrice Morgan. We were told she lives here. I am Beatrice. Though my name is different now, Beatrice Crow." She descended the steps slowly, her hand protectively on her belly. "Who are you?" "My name is Ruth Fletcher. I ran a home for unwed mothers in Redemption Flats." Ruth's voice was steady, but edged with exhaustion. "Or I did, until the town council shut us down last week. Said we were encouraging sin. These women had nowhere else to go." Beatrice felt her heart clench. She looked at the women, saw her own past reflected in their faces. The shame, the fear, the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, someone would help. "How did you know to come here?" A miner passing through told us about you. About what happened to you, how you survived, how you built a life here. These women need what you found. A place where they can be safe, where their children can be born without judgment. Ruth's grip on the shotgun tightened. "I know it is asking a lot. We have nothing to offer except our labor. But I am begging you, do not turn them away." Beatrice looked back at Margaret, who had come to stand on the porch. The older woman studied the scene, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, and Beatrice felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "We will not turn you away," Beatrice said firmly. "Any of you. Margaret runs this boarding house, but I think we can make room." "Room?" Margaret snorted. "We will make a whole damn wing if we have to. Thomas, go round up the men. We have got construction to do. Ruth, get those women inside and fed. They look like they have not had a decent meal in days." The transformation happened quickly. The boarders, those rough miners and farmers who had defended Beatrice 2 years ago, threw themselves into the work with the same fierce loyalty. Within a week, they had converted the old barn into temporary housing. Within a month, they had built a proper structure, large enough to house a dozen women and their children, with a kitchen and a common room and private spaces for those who needed them. Dalton worked alongside the other men, his carpentry skills proving invaluable. But Beatrice noticed he also spent time with the women themselves, teaching them practical skills. How to shoot, how to trap, how to read tracks. He treated them with the same quiet respect he had shown her, never asking about their pasts, only helping them build their futures. One evening, as they lay in bed with Grace asleep between them and the baby doing acrobatics in Beatrice's belly, Dalton spoke into the darkness. "You are doing what was done for you. Passing it forward, we are doing it. All of us." Beatrice turned to look at him in the moonlight, filtering through the window. "You could have left. You could have decided this was too much, too complicated. But you stayed. You are helping to build something bigger than just our family. I stayed because this is where I belong. With you, with Grace, with whatever comes next." He placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "My mother used to say that we are defined by what we protect. I spent most of my life protecting only myself, moving through the world like a ghost. But now I have something worth protecting. People worth protecting. That changes everything." 3 weeks later, Beatrice went into labor in the middle of a thunderstorm. The sky opened up with a fury that seemed almost biblical, rain hammering the roof, lightning turning night into day. But inside the boarding house, surrounded by Margaret and Ruth, and several of the women she had helped, Beatrice felt no fear. This birth was nothing like Grace's. This birth happened in a bed with clean sheets, with skilled hands to help her, with her husband waiting just outside the door. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Beatrice laughed through her tears. A son, healthy and strong, with a shock of black hair and lungs that could probably be heard in the next county. Dalton entered the room at Margaret's summons and stopped dead at the sight of his son. "You can hold him," Beatrice said, exhausted but glowing. "He is yours too." Dalton approached slowly, as if the baby might shatter if he moved too quickly. He took his son with the same careful reverence he had shown Grace that night in the desert, and Beatrice saw his eyes shine with unshed tears. "What will we name him?" I was thinking James, for my first husband, who would have loved to meet him. "And Samuel, for your mother's father, the name you told me once you wished you could have carried." She watched Dalton's face, saw the emotion wash over him. "James Samuel Crow. If that suits you, it suits me," Dalton said roughly, his voice thick. "It suits me fine. The years that followed were not perfect. There were hard times, winters that tested their resources, women who arrived too broken to heal completely, moments when Beatrice wondered if they had taken on too much. But there were also triumphs. Women who learned trades and started their own businesses. Children who grew up knowing they were wanted and loved. A community that slowly, gradually, began to see that judging people for their circumstances was a cruelty it could choose not to perpetrate. Grace grew into a fierce, protective older sister who appointed herself James's guardian and took the job seriously. The boarding house became known throughout the territory as a place where people who had been cast out could find refuge. Ruth stayed on as a permanent resident, helping to manage the growing operation. Her shotgun always within reach but rarely needed. On a summer evening 5 years after that first desperate night in the desert, Beatrice stood on the porch of what everyone now called the sanctuary, watching the sun set over the mountains. Grace, now 7, was teaching James to catch fireflies, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Dalton emerged from the new workshop he had built, sawdust in his hair, and came to stand beside her. "Thinking about something?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Thinking about how far we have come. How much has changed." She leaned into him, comfortable and content. "That town tried to kill me. They wanted me to die alone and forgotten, a cautionary tale about the wages of sin. Instead, I am here. We are here. And we have helped dozens of women escape the same fate. You helped them. You are the one they look to, the one who shows them it is possible to survive and thrive." Dalton pressed a kiss to her temple. "I just build things and hunt. You build hope. We build it together. All of us. That is what makes it strong," Margaret called from inside, announcing dinner was ready. The household gathered as they did every evening, a mix of boarders and refugees and children and friends, all sitting together at the long tables Dalton had constructed. Grace said grace, her young voice clear and certain, thanking God for food and family and second chances. As Beatrice looked around the table at all these faces that had become her family, she felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the suffering that had brought her here, but for the strength she had discovered in surviving it, for the people who had chosen to help when they could have looked away, for the life she had built from the ruins of the life that had been taken from her. After dinner, when the children were in bed and the house had quieted, Beatrice sat in the rocking chair Dalton had made for her, nursing their youngest, a daughter born just 6 months ago and named Mary for Margaret, who had wept openly when they told her. Through the window, she could see the lights of Silver Creek, could hear the distant sound of music from the saloon, the everyday sounds of a town living its life. She thought about that desperate girl stumbling through the desert, bleeding and alone, certain she was going to die. She thought about the moment Dalton had kicked down that door, how her life had pivoted on that single act of compassion. She thought about every person who had helped since, every hand extended, every door opened, every judgment withheld. Dalton entered quietly and sat on the floor beside her chair, his head resting against her knee. "What are you thinking about now? About how I was beaten and cast out for bringing a daughter into this world. How they wanted me to be ashamed, to hide, to disappear. And instead, I am here, with 3 children and a husband who loves me, running a sanctuary for women just like I was. She stroked his hair gently. I am thinking about how the greatest revenge is not in striking back, but in thriving despite everything they did to stop you. You have certainly done that. We have done that. Together, she paused, then added softly, and we will keep doing it. For every woman who needs it. For every child who deserves a chance. This is our purpose now. This is what we were meant to build. Outside, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. The desert breathed its cool night air. And in a small house in a small town that had chosen kindness over cruelty, a family that had been forged in fire and pain, and ultimately love prepared for another day of doing the work that mattered. The work of healing. The work of hope. The work of proving that survival is not just about living, but about building a life worth living and helping others do the same.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.